Okay, so welcome everyone and good afternoon. And this is Sophia from the French May Arts Festival, taking care of the exhibition and the education programs. And first of all, welcome to our first talk of our exhibition. And we are really grateful, like here finally, physically with all of you, and especially like the pandemic situation. I'm really thankful for that. But at the same time, we take advantage of the technology that we have our live streaming provided on our Facebook page. So hi there who are watching us on our Facebook. And today, we kickstart our program for the very first section as an introduction to the Surrealism in general, and also for the exhibition as well. And I'm honored to have here with us Professor Frank Vignon. Frank holds many titles. He is chair of the Department of Fine Arts at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Besides dedicating his time teaching at CUHK of the Chinese and Western art history, modernism and postmodernism theories of art, Frank is also a practitioner artist, having held several solo exhibitions in Hong Kong and has taken part in international shows as well. And for today's talk, Frank will walk us through the provenance of Surrealism as an art and literary movement in its heyday and how its influence has persisted present day, with many prolific artists that paved the way. And he also draws on the significance of dreams and reality in Surrealism, and also the undermining notion of psychoanalysis and unconsciousness will be also the main focus. Just anything you will need to know before you visit our exhibitions later. So now, without further delay, I will pass the mic to Frank. And yeah, please.
Thank you, Sophia. All right, so this is basically bits and pieces of the lectures I give to my students, in fact, on the course on modernist art and the course on art theory. So we'll start with the man who is often referred to as the Pope of Surrealism, André Breton. Basically, the initial theory about Surrealism in art, and this includes the literary art, because we should never forget that Surrealism is as much a literary movement as a visual art movement, in fact. And Breton himself, although he did some works, yes, this is, for instance, a collage he did in 1925, so that's really early, considering the history of Surrealism. I think you guys can hear me right. Oh, yes, but it's online. Yeah, sorry, I forgot. But really, he was a writer, and he was also an art critic and a theorist. In reality, the theory of Surrealism is something he worked on from the 1920s up to his death in the 1960s. Okay, it really never stopped being reshaped and reformulated in a number of very important texts. Those texts were not just, but they were the most famous ones are called manifestos. So a manifesto, as you probably know, is a statement, usually made by one artist or a group of artists describing what their intentions are. The first really famous manifesto was written by Marinetti, the leader of the Futurists in Italy, and they were the first movement to really try to use art to shock people into the realization of different realities. So to shock the bourgeois, to shock the middle class was sort of one of their missions. And in the manifestos of Surrealism, this idea to really shake the foundations of Western culture is there from the start, really. This is something that I really enjoyed, in particular in the catalog of the exhibition, but also in all the captions, all the wall text you will see. This emphasis on myth and mythology. Surrealism really starts around the late 20s. It was very clear by then that fascism was going to reshape Western culture in rather unpleasant ways. And a number of people, including the Surrealists, and including André Breton, believed that in a world where religion was no longer taking a significant place, you needed something to replace it. So it doesn't mean he was trying to create a new religion. On the contrary, he was very much against that sort of things. But he was thinking of trying to define a new way to relate to the world that would take shape in artworks, in poetry, in paintings, in sculpture, and so on, that would try to avoid the exaggerated importance that rationality and reason had taken since the 18th century. So we'll see a lot of references to this. But suffice it to say right now that this man, André Breton, was, for better or worse, really the leader of the movement. He was a bit of a control freak. I don't think he was a very nice person at all. He had no problems organizing tribunal to judge members of the Surrealist group, to expel them from the group, and so on, according to what he believed was the right thing to do for Surrealism. So there was a great deal of personal confrontations within the groups that were principally his fault. Okay. Once we know this, we still have to admire the writings, the theory, and so on, and especially his poetry and his literary attempts that still remain one of the most important parts of modernist literature in Europe. So this also took shape in a number of publications, magazines in particular. The first one was called La Révolution Surréaliste, Surrealist Revolution. And this would take a very literal sense at the time of the second manifesto of Surrealism, when the idea that the art were basically not enough. You needed something that would somehow continue that effort in a more deep aspects of society. And this was the time they got to get closer to the Communist Party. So please remember that by the 1920s and early 30s, although if you wanted to make an effort, you would know what was going on in the Soviet Union. But most people didn't know. So there was still a hope. Okay, and the catalogue in particular talks about a novel written by Aragon, one of the poets and writers of Surrealism, who was an early member of the French Communist Party and remained so until his death, and he died in the 1980s. So that was an important part of some of the ideas of Surrealism. But it was a very complicated moment. Breton very quickly realized that communism, especially the way it was shaped by the French Communist Party, had little to offer to Surrealism. But some members remained communist, others came out, and it was one of those many moments where the movement was somehow disbanded, reorganized, all this because of the ideas of Breton. The catalogue also insists a lot on the sort of two trends of Surrealism, although, to be perfectly honest, to call what this man, Georges Battai, was looking for Surrealism is a bit of a misrepresentation. But they were very close, and in some ways opposites, where Breton was more interested in, so I don't want to go into too much details, but in this, the idealist philosophy coming out of Plato and so on. There was still a lot of this in Breton's idea of Surrealism, whereas Georges Battai wanted to move away from idealism and was very interested in ideas related to the body, for instance, that instead of being a soul in the world, we are bodies in the world. And Georges Battai is also one of the most important literary theorists of the 20th century. His work still is being read throughout all the universities of the world, still being making a point. And he was very much against Breton and founded another magazine called Document, as you can see. And the real big difference, okay, I'll go back to this. I just want to show you the cover of Minotaur. So you have pretty much all the copies of this magazine, okay, published in the 1930s, which is a publication made with the two men, Breton and Battai, together. All right, so this sort of brings together a lot of the notions that were until then confrontational. So again, I don't want to go too much in details there, but just to emphasize the fact that Surrealism is a very complex theoretical movement also, all right? We tend to know about this through the works of, in particular, Salvador Dali, and of course Magritte, which I will show you now. There's a lot more to it than this, okay? And if you're really interested, I really would encourage you to buy the catalog, even though, you know, this being Hong Kong, people don't really have a lot of space to keep that kind of books. So Georges Battai creates the magazine Document. He also creates the magazine Acéphale, which means without a head, which is exactly where Bataille's idea of the surrealism takes this direction of the experience of the body, okay? And the cover was made by André Masson, who remained a surrealist artist all his life, but also belonging to various trends within the movements of surrealism. So this, of course, we should never forget that, Breton starts as a medical student in the early 20th century, and is one of the early admirers of the writings of Sigmund Freud. Okay, so psychoanalysis, the idea of the unconscious, and so on, are the foundation of the entire movement. Okay, this is true for both Breton and Bataille. All right, there was no exceptions there. They were all following and paying attention to the theories of Sigmund Freud. And I think a good way to look at how these theories are really literally made visible in the works of surrealism, I think we can look at this video. So sorry, just because we don't really need the sound here. The sound was added decades later. So this is a clip from the film Un chien andalou. So the title means a dog from Andalusia. Andalusia is a region from southern Spain. There's no dog in the film, and it's taking place in Paris. So this is, you know, one of those surrealist puns that are very, very common. But I just want to emphasize how much sexuality and the way it was explored by Sigmund Freud and how it really shaped our existence is something that was represented in this wonderful film. Okay, hold on. So the directors are both Luis Buñuel, a Spanish director who continued making surrealist film until his death in the 1970s, and Dali, Salvador Dali. Okay, so the young man clearly wants to have sex with the young woman. There's no doubt to this. You know, that's sort of a rather disgusting little faces and so on. These are the sort of things that Dali was really fascinated in, and also Battai, by the way. So she's going to defend herself, but she won't have to. Why? Because according to Sigmund Freud, the mind, people, are basically made of various levels. You have the id, which is the Latin word for this, which is basically the unconscious, this thing that is unknown. You have the ego, the I, which is basically what interacts with the outside world. And you have the superego, which is basically how culture and society controls all these rather violent forces. So you can start by, oops, bloody hell, sorry. I have to start again. I don't know how to use this. Where is I can't see the bloody... Can someone help me, please? I want to go faster. I can't see the arrow.
There.
There's no arrow. Where is the bloody mouse? So I can't.
Oh. Do you want to use the pointer?
No, I want to go faster. Okay, anyway. So, we will see the young man being stopped from, enacting his desire to rape the young woman. How? Well, he will have to carry with him, and this is a literal representation of the superego. First, you will see on the ropes he's going to hold. You have two tablets. And of course, the two tablets are, and remember Dali and Buñuel are both from a Catholic country. All right, they are the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Okay, in particular, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Then you have the two grand piano, which are always representation of high culture in the works of Dali. So, culture will keep you from raping your neighbor. You have two priests, okay, remember, Dali comes from a Catholic country. And I don't know if you saw, yes, here they are, the two dead donkeys. Okay, the two dead donkeys are a very important aspect of all the symbolism of Salvador Dali. One of the paintings upstairs, William Tell, has a piano, a grand piano with a dead donkey on it. Okay, it's a childhood experience. He saw a dead donkey rotting in the countryside, eaten by ants. So ants will become a symbol of death in his paintings. Very often related to his father. So the dead donkey on the piano for him are, a visual representation of the death of classical culture and how classical culture basically keeps you from, living a meaningful life in a sense, if you want to put it in those terms. So movies like the films of Buñuel and Dali are actually, once you have the key to these symbols, they are quite transparent, okay? But of course, this is a movie from 1929, and very few people in the general public would know anything about psychoanalysis or Freud. So, okay, these were seen as very, very daring pieces. The movie we have in the exhibition is the L'Âge d'Or, the Golden Age, which was actually forbidden to be screened until 1980, which is a rather shocking thing to say, because when you watch the movie, it's not that terrible, okay? Although there's a lot of it related to the works of the Marquis de Sade, this 18th century writer whose work gave the word sadism, to get sexual gratification by hurting people. This is the core of his novels. And the movie in the exhibition somehow relates to this. Okay, so hold on. I just want to show you a few things. In the pages of the magazine Minotaur, for instance, you had an article of Breton on these medium painter. By that I mean people who made visual art, usually sleeping or in a state of paralysis. Okay, they didn't know what they were doing and still managed to make these works. And just wanted to point that out because this is something that means to me personally something very important. The man you see here, and this was in the Minotaur magazine, all right, with the article by Breton, is a man called Augusta Lussage, who was a mediumnic painter from the north of France, and he used to live in a village where my family is from. And my great-grandfather had Parkinson's disease, and Mr. Lussage would come on Sunday to put his hand on my great-grandfather's head. And for a few hours, he would stop shaking. Okay, so that's the power of the mind, I suppose. So the same magazine, Minotaur, also does something very important. And remember, this is something that has to do with Battai. In this magazine document, Battai also asked a lot of writers doing ethnology to write about what was then called primitive societies. And there's a lot of questionable vocabulary being used by the ethnologists of the early 20th century, because they were considering that African societies, for instance, were like living in childhood, whereas European So that's the kind of attitude that is no longer acceptable. But at the same time, the ethnologists who were writing in Documents and eventually also started to write for Minotaur, in the context of Surrealism, were the first to really take an interest in the societies of places like, Central Africa, South Africa, to try to understand where this art was coming from. Because the art itself, like those doggone masks, for instance, from Central Africa, played a very important role in the inspiration of the Surrealists. So whereas African masks had been of great interest for people like Picasso in Cubism, also the German Expressionist artist, the fact is that both the Expressionists and Picasso had no interest in the societies that created these works. The first one to really take an interest in terms of sociology, ethnology, were the Surrealists in the context of these magazines. So they really play a very important part. All right, and okay, we can skip this. I just want to show you this because I think it's a good visual representation of what it means to try to go beyond the rationality that was supposed to be, the core of Western culture. The Enlightenment, the 18th century philosophers put reason at the center of human activities. And, in the 1920s, if you had survived the First World War, which was butchery, it was very difficult to believe in anything related to the notion of Western civilization. How can you call a civilization that led to the death of millions of people, in this horrible circumstances? So the idea that we should go beyond reason really made sense. It also made sense for the Dada artists. And, it's very difficult to separate Dada from Surrealism because so many artists of the Dada movement eventually came to Paris and became members of the Surrealist movement. But this idea that you need to criticize reason was very, very important. And one way to do this is to push a logical reasoning to its absolute conclusion. So, and I think those are a very good example. These are not paintings by Magritte, but I'm going to show you a painting by Magritte. So they are based on this famous painting of Manet, The Balcony, which is with his family, in fact. And this painting from, sorry, I can't see anything because of the steam. Yes, it's exactly 1800 by Jacques-Louis David. And Magritte was thinking what would happen to these people on the painting, because, they're still there because the painting is still there. But if you want to be logical, you'll have to conclude that by now, everyone in this painting is dead. Okay, so this is what Magritte did. He pushed that to its ultimate conclusion. So everyone in these paintings, they are exactly the same place. I love the fact that this coffin is sitting down. It's very funny. And this one is also sitting down with Madame Récamier in her coffin. All right. So it's very humorous, it's very funny, and it's intended to be funny. Okay. And not everyone was like that, but Magritte in particular was famous for being a funny guy. And for him, humor was one of the ways you can undermine the rationality that Western culture was supposed to be about. All right, so don't worry, you don't have to read any of this. This is what I give to my students so that they can revise in peace. I know they don't, right? Don't get me wrong, but so that I don't give them an excuse not to know anything. I really love that photo. So Breton actually went to Mexico before the war, where he met very important people. The fat guy is Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican artist, the muralist artist, who is probably more famous today for being the husband twice of Frida Kahlo. And the little bearded guy is Leon Trotsky. All right, Leon Trotsky is one of the persons who organized the Russian Revolution. But by then, Joseph Stalin wanted him dead. So he went into exile, and he was in Mexico, where he was eventually murdered by a Russian spy. And Breton is there, very happy. He was very interested in the theories of Leon Trotsky. And this really shows you this attempt by Breton and many artists of the Surrealist movement to not stick to just the arts. For them, they were all artists, and that's all they were doing. But they really believed that their art was also playing a role in they wouldn't use the term, but I would say political change, okay? It was very difficult, unfortunately, because the Communist Party in France was completely following the orders of Moscow. And if you were, at the time of Joseph Stalin, so it didn't go well. So by the time Breton meets Trotsky in Mexico, he was already somehow detached from the French Communist Party, whereas some of the other members of the Surrealist group were still there. So there was a tendency of Breton to try to integrate anybody he could think of into the Surrealist movement. So, of course, there were artists that he was not interested in, so they were never invited. But sometimes he was sort of inviting someone to be a member of the group. The person would come along, would see how complicated the personal relationships were within the groups, and would generally, sometimes they would go away. This is something that happens with Picasso, for instance. Picasso accepted to do the first cover of Minotaur, but never really wanted to be part of the group. Breton somehow ignored this. In his mind, they were part of Surrealism. So this happened, for instance, with Giorgio Dicarico, this Italian artist. There are several works of his upstairs. And even though you have group photos of Surrealist artists, and Dicarico is sometimes there, the fact is that Dicarico was a bit too independent as an artist to really want to belong to that group. All the same, this dreamlike atmosphere of his, especially his initial works, like these big cities, were very much part of the sort of things that the Surrealists were interested in. We will see other artists representing the night city they see in their dream. There's a very famous 19th century French poet called Gérard de Nerval, who even wrote a famous short story about the cities you visit in your dreams. So these were the sort of literary and artistic background that fascinated the Surrealists. They were looking in the past for references to this, and they were looking in the present to any artists who somehow related to this. And this is very typically the case of Giorgio Dicarico. Okay, so you'll have famous artworks of him upstairs. This is a work done in 1914, which is rather striking because you have this profile here. Did you see it? Yeah, it's not very clear. So the profile here looks exactly like the profile of the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. You see the name here. The first time the word surrealism was used is in the text by Apollinaire, right? And that was before the theoretical inventions of surrealism by Breton. And this painting is particularly famous because it was done in 1914, and Apollinaire, being of age, unfortunately fought in the First World War and was wounded in the head, exactly where you see the circle being made. That was several years before the accident, okay? So to me, that's one of the unfortunate things about André Breton. He was fascinated by dreams, fascinated by Sigmund Freud, but from time to time, he could not help believing that dreams were also announcing the future somehow, all right? Which is really, where you see that they didn't want to have anything to do with reason and rationality. So this painting by Dicarico to me is important because it reminds us of Guillaume Apollinaire, of the fact that surrealism is a term that was invented before by Guillaume Apollinaire, before Breton put it into use. Okay. So now, the unconscious we really have a problem with the unconscious because we don't have access to it. We cannot control it. We cannot see in it. That's why Freud called it the id. This, because there's no name for it, right? And even Freud never really even attempted to define what the unconscious was. Somehow he related it to the ideas of Platonism, which is really something that, Georges Battai, the guy who did the other magazine, reacted violently against. The first attempt to define the unconscious would be made much later by another psychoanalyst, French, called Jacques Lacan. I will show him in a few minutes. So if you want to base your artistic activity on the unconscious, if you want to get, to ignore what your conscious mind tells you to do, there's actually no possibility to do this, okay? So you can only do this somehow indirectly. And the two methods the Surrealists came up with to try to tap onto the unconscious are automatism and the Cadavrex. So what does this mean? So first, automatism is basically trying to do things without thinking about it. I think a good exercise is, you're on the phone, you have a piece of paper in front of you, you're talking, and your hand still does stuff, right? That's automatic writing. It's not controlled by your conscious mind, all right? And a lot of artists of Surrealism did this. So you have two ways to exploit these drawings. You either look at what you did without thinking and try to identify forms that can be transformed into something figurative. André Masson does that a lot. Okay, we have several drawings made like this upstairs. Or the automatic drawings you've done, you just keep it as an abstract work. So it's not figurative, it doesn't show people, animals, or anything like this, it just shows shape. Which explains why the Surrealism, also leads kind of naturally to abstract painting, okay, which is very much something that the American artists will exploit, as I will, hopefully, I'll have the time to show you. The other method is to try to sort of give up control. And you understand that in the context of automatism, accidents are desirable. Right? Something you do without wanting it, something you do by accident is something you keep, because according to Freud, that's precisely where the unconscious manifests itself. Okay? So another way to give up control is to give basically control to other people, or share control so that nobody is really completely in charge, which is the context of Cadavrex. So Cadavrex is the first sentence made with that technique. Exquisite corpse, the complete sentence is the exquisite corpse, drink the new wine. So it's nonsensical because every word was given by someone who didn't know what the others were thinking. Okay, so, sorry, I'm showing you in drawings what you can do with a Cadavrex key. So it usually happens like this, and sometimes in some sheets of paper you see the folds. I don't think I have one here. Actually, you can sort of, yes, you can see them here, in fact. You see these lines? So someone starts a drawing on a piece of paper, then folds the paper so that only the bottom part of it appears. And then you give the sheet of paper to someone else who continues the drawing, continue folding so that by the time the piece of paper is handed to a third person, only the bottom part of the drawing appears. Okay, so you can build up a complete form like that, and nobody will have seen the complete drawing. All right, and they've done that with a lot. So for instance, here you have Max Maurice Man Ray, one of the American photographer, Yves Tanguy, who will also go to America, and Joan Miró, the Spanish artist. Here you have André Masson, Max Ernst, and Max Maurice also, all right. So for them, this was a way to relinquish control. You give up control as an artist, try to share it among everybody else without letting anybody know what the others are doing, all right? So again, this is based on the idea that accidents are more interesting than things you do intentionally, all right? This is typically based on the early notions of Surrealism. So one of the first artists to practice automatic drawing systematically was André Masson. So I've shown you his face before. He is the guy who did the cover of Acéphale, all right? He died in, he was over 90 years old. He died in the late 80s. So I didn't see it, unfortunately. I had friends who saw him in an exhibition in Paris in the mid-80s, and he was in a wheelchair, and people were asking him if he was still drawing. And he says, no, I stopped drawings once I was in a wheelchair, because when I was young, I used to dance a lot when I was drawing. And this is actually an important statement, because you have to realize that, sorry, automatic drawing is best done when you really try not to think too much about what you're doing. And the best way to do this is to have your bodies do something that is not related, okay? So he was dancing, he was sort of jumping around the room, just putting traces on a piece of paper, trying not to think about what he was doing, okay? Once he was done doing that, he would start to recognize shapes in the lines that he traced on the paper. And I was glad to see that we have a lot of drawings upstairs in the exhibitions, but very often he would take these drawings and sort of translate them into the medium of oil. He was also, and to be perfectly honest, I've only read about it, so I don't know how he was doing it. He was also using sand to do his paintings. So he would mix up paint and sand on a piece of canvas, sort of play around with it. Again, I don't know really how he was doing it. But again, this was basing your inspiration on accident. Okay, I think maybe the word inspiration is not right here. Okay, so he was doing things that were more or less figurative. Okay, you can recognize a hand here and basically, a portrait. This is more tricky because it seems to be based on automatic drawings. The fact is that it was also based on references to the past. Okay, this is a very famous painting by Rubens, the Flemish artist from the 17th century. There's another one upstairs by Masson, also inspired by a Rubens painting. And there you start seeing that an artist like Masson, even though he was really a pioneer in automatic drawings and automatic paintings, is also someone who eventually would not want to be stuck with these methods all his life. So at some point, he sort of explored something that brought together his love and admiration of the works of the paintings of the past with his own techniques of automatism. Okay, so Masson, this one, for instance, was also inspired by a poem written by Antonin Artaud. And I was very happy that Sophia here put into the catalogue of the exhibition a drawing by Artaud, who is one of the most important poets of Surrealism, although not Surrealism. He was part of the Surrealist group, but then was kicked out of it by Breton. And his importance also lies in his influence on the theater, which is something I will talk about tomorrow in my conversation with Septime Weber, who is the head of Hong Kong Ballet. Okay, sorry, I'll have to skip this. So let's move on to Dali, which is basically the most famous artist of Surrealism. Everybody knows him. And I might as well show you right now the reason why he is so famous. Sorry, far too many examples. Okay, here we are. This is an ad from the early 1970s. So I was basically a child when this happened. Oh, sorry, I think this requires music. So this is an ad for a chocolate.
Je suis fou du chocolat l'envers.
I guarantee you that you will never forget that. I was probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 when I saw that on TV. And I can't remember a time when I didn't know the existence of Salvador Dali, all right? And that's true pretty much of everybody in my generation in Europe, okay? So he was not just a very important artist and surprisingly also a very productive theorist, even though his theory is a bit messy, okay? But I guess that was part of the importance of his theory. You know all this, and again, this is all kind of transparent. Once you know some of the keys of these paintings, the background very much looks like the area where he grew up, not far from Barcelona. The soft watches, is something anybody vaguely interested in philosophy in the early 20th century would know of Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who wrote about time in particular, and stating that there's no such thing as time. There's only the perception of time. And as you know, you've all been to very boring lectures. Time can feel very, very long. Okay, and when it's exciting, it's very, very short. So time is flexible, which is what these soft watches are about. I've already talked to you about the ants, right? This is a childhood experience of death. Okay, so it's all there. And you have this rather strange shape, which is actually, it's a rock that is there and also not far from his childhood home. And the profile kind of looks like him, with the mustache and the eyes and the big nose and everything. And you'll see the rock in many other paintings, in fact. Okay, so this is The Great Masturbator, the painting that he wanted to show to Sigmund Freud, who told him that it was very good, but it had nothing to do with psychoanalysis. You see it here again. This is a portrait of his sworn enemy. This is a portrait of another great poet of Surrealism, Paul Éluard, who happened to be the husband of Gala. Gala was Dali's wife until she passed away. All right, so there was a lot of unpleasantness between the two men. Okay, I think I need to show you this because this is also quite typical of automatism and what Surrealism brought to the making of these images. Look at the title. Okay, Dali at the age of 6 when he thought he was a girl. This is textbook psychoanalytic issues. Lifting the skin of the water to see a dog sleeping in the shade of the sea. Typical automatic sentence, all right? A lot of poetry was written like this. Interestingly, Breton theorized this using the theories of psychoanalysis. The fact is that these accidental sentences were also practiced by the Dada writers before that, okay? Tristan Tzara, who eventually became a member of the Surrealist group, was also practicing that kind of writing. So you produce a sentence like this, and then you illustrate it, okay? And with his classical training, Dali was perfectly capable of doing this, all right? Okay, so there's also another famous text about the Angelus of Millet. So Millet was a naturalist, a realist painter from the 19th century. And Dali had something of an obsession about this that had something to do with his father. So there's a lot of versions that Dali made of the Angelus of Millet. In this version, you see, in fact, the artist as a little boy and his father. I will record a guided tour on Thursday, and one of the examples I will take is the painting upstairs of William Tell, which is all about Dali and his relationship with his father. old textbook psychoanalysis with castration and all these unpleasantness. The two men didn't get along at all. And this vision of buildings in the shape of the Angelus of Millet is really typical of a lot of other paintings he made, according to this painting. So this is, these are images of the article Dali wrote about the Angelus of Millet in a Minotaur in the magazine. And here you see some paintings of Millet that I've never seen anywhere else, all right? So I don't really know where they are. But of a little boy who seems to be wanting to eat his mother, of a man who seems to be masturbating on a grand scale, and about a mother who seems to be unhealthily interested by the jactai of her little boy. All right, so it's all, again, textbook psychoanalysis, and that's the sort of things that Dali really enjoyed developing. So you have these paintings of here. In the background, you have another version, his own version of the Angelus. And his sexual ambivalence here is very well represented by the sort of dual image of his own wife, Gala, all right, who was married to another poet before. You have here this very interesting image of, so this is supposed to be Lenin, okay, all right, who seems to be telling Gala, his wife, Dali's wife, that he wants to have sex with her or something like this. This is the Russian writer Achille Gorky, all right, no relation to the painter upstairs. And he's eavesdropping, and we know this because there's a lobster on his head. And the lobster it was something Dali used in another artwork with a telephone, which was, according to Breton, a portrait of Vincent van Gogh. All right, think about it. If you want to try to give a call with that phone, what would happen to your ear? Aha. All right, so it's a portrait of Vincent van Gogh. And also sort of a stand-in for eavesdropping, which is what you do on a telephone. So you're going back to this. So you have the telephone, and Achille Gorky is eavesdropping. And we know it's about sex because the whole painting is dominated by the Angelus of Millet. All right. So that's why, for all its madness, there's a great deal of coherence to the work of Salvador Dali. Once you start reading his writings and you start, identifying all these clues in his paintings, it's incredibly coherent and, dare I say it, logical in a sort of surrealist, crazy way, of course. So I won't show it to you, but I just want to, because it's upstairs, all right? This is L'Âge d'Or, the movie, the Golden Age. And towards the end, one of the characters throw out the windows a lot of things. He throws out the window a bishop, for instance, which is, of course, about religion. He throws a plow out the window, which is, of course, the critique of work. And he also throws out the window a fake giraffe burning, which I would guess is probably a phallic symbol in flame, all right, which is also something you see in a number of other paintings by Dali. Okay, so the film is a little long to be watched standing in a gallery, but you should really make an effort and watch the whole thing. Okay, so we've seen this. Construction with Bourbon, premonition of civil war in 1936. You know that the Spanish Civil War was one of the most disastrous moment before the Second World War. Also something that sort of produced Picasso's Guernica. So this is Dali's take on this, all right? There would be plenty more to say, like this portrait of Gala as the Virgin of Guadalupe. Virgin of Guadalupe is a famous image from Mexico that's sort of central to the Christian faith in South America. And this is his own interpretation of his own virgin, which is his wife, okay? And we'll never really know, but apparently they never had sexual relations, right? There seems to have been purely a platonic couple, even though Gala herself had millions of lovers. This is another painting influenced by the Catholic religion. This is somehow influenced by, I couldn't find it, a portrait of this great mystic poet from Spain from the 17th century called Saint John of the Cross. And the famous portrait of him that, again, I could never find, where he is represented, his head lowered. So you can only see the top of his head, basically, which is what inspired him to do this painting of Christ, which is also very, very famous. Okay, so yes, Dali was himself not a religious person, although he had to admit that, of course, his whole upbringing, his difficulties with his father, and all this came from the way the Christian religion, especially Catholic in its Catholic form, really shaped his entire outlook. So a lot of his later work were him basically dealing with his Catholic upbringing. Okay, so you've seen this before. Maybe now is a good time to emphasize the fact that even though Paris is really central to Surrealism itself, it's the city of Surrealism until the war, at least. But at the same time, Surrealism is very much an international movement. All right, you had people from all over Europe, but you also had Americans. All right, in many ways, Diego Rivera from Mexico was also very much a surrealist. You could say that also of Frida Kahlo. So Surrealism is something that really influenced basically the entire Western world. All right, maybe even more than that. So our German artist is, of course, Max Ernst, and I just want to skip. So he did a lot of things, like for instance, this work is also something that you would find in the practices of some Dada artists, especially Kurt Schwitters, who was the first to use garbage to make art. Max Ernst also did this. So that's where you see that, from Dada to Surrealism, it's a continuum. There's really no separation between the two movements. Okay, so I just want to show you. Oh, okay, I'll go back to this. Sorry, this one. Okay, so this is Max Ernst, who is showing you how to do frottage. So frottage comes from the French frotter, which means to rub something. So you basically take a rock, a piece of wood, anything, and you put a piece of paper on this, and with charcoal or a pencil, you just reproduce the texture of this. And it's interesting because it's kind of the fundamentals, techniques that you will learn in any visual art department around the world, all right? Any drawing classes will have at least one moment where you will do that sort of things, okay? And this is very, very typical because what he will see in these drawings, he will emphasize the stuff that reminds him of other things, like animals or plants. And he's a bit, he's rather funny because in the video, Max Ernst explains that a lot of what he's doing eventually looks like a forest. So he'll do a lot of forests. He will also apply similar techniques to oil painting. And there's one upstairs that is made like this. And at the end of the video, but again, it's just a little too long, because there are so many forests in what he does, like this, or cities or stuff like this. Okay, there's the first one. Oops, sorry, I don't see it. It doesn't matter. His love of forests, and the fact that he's German also, made him very sensitive to the early poets of Romanticism in Germany, especially people like Novalis, which he refers to very, very, very often. And the fact is that if you're thinking that Surrealism is about dreams, is about the unconscious, you can find a lot of precedents in German Romanticism in particular. Okay, but not just German, but they were basically the first to do this. both in literature and in the visual arts. And to be perfectly honest, you could not understand Sigmund Freud and his idea of the unconscious without realizing that the lot of, let's say German-speaking art was about nature in what was called the sublime, nature in its scary ways. And that's also something that influenced very, very heavily a surrealist artist. Sorry, I have to look at the time. All right, so maybe I'll go a little faster on a few things. So this is Johann Miro. These wonderful works that eventually this will lead him to a full-fledged abstract art. And what I mean by abstract art, I mean non-figurative, okay, just shapes and colors where you cannot recognize objects. That's sort of one definition of abstract art. But even that abstract art that comes later in the work of Miro comes out of sort of reinterpretation of reality. Okay, so this is the hunter. So you have the hunter here, which is basically reduced to an eye. All right, the gun is reduced to some sort of mechanical parts. This is the dog of the hunter. All right. Initially, you can find also this famous painting, which the first time you see it in a room, it looks like an abstract painting. The fact is that it's not. It's purely a figurative painting, directly inspired by this Dutch artwork. Okay, so this is another way to deal with this pursuit of the unconscious. All right. To be perfectly honest, if you stick to surrealism as Automatism or Cadavrex, I don't know where to fit this. Okay, it's neither one nor the other, and yet Miro is always considered to be an artist of surrealism. All right, so because he also did a lot of things for the stage later on in life, I will talk about him tomorrow in my talk with Septime. Okay. All right, so we have to talk a bit about Magritte. So I don't think I have it here. Okay, maybe I'll talk about this too. This one in particular. The issues with language is also something that somehow fascinated a number of surrealists. Very normally the poets, of course. But to empty words of their meaning is also something that interested a number of artists. And that led to a number of questions that would be asked much later by especially some famous French philosophers. One of them, the most important concerning this painting, would be Michel Foucault. So this is very famous. This is a painting that says this is not a pipe, okay, which is also a reflection on the nature of representation. Why is this not a pipe? Because it's a painting. Okay, you can't hold it, you can't smoke it. It's not a pipe, all right? So it's a good question to ask and a good thing to remind us of, that painting is not the thing it represents, all right? But the moment you start thinking like this, you start asking very important questions on the nature of representation. What is a painting? It's something that points to something else. Here you have a painting of a painting in a painting. Okay? So you start creating this cascade of questions that in the end, if you really want to start thinking about it, it really unmoors you from questions of logic and how language has anything to do with truth, for instance. So these wonderful visual games, in fact, ask questions that, have never stopped being addressed by other artists and other philosophers ever since, which is why, that was sort of the title of the talk. It's still alive. We're still dealing with these questions today. And whether they can ever be answered is another question that is very interesting to ask. All right, so I was very happy to see that we had some magazines of this series called Fantomas It's popular literature. It's the adventures of the Emperor of Crime. It was one of the most popular novels published in France in the early 20th century. It was also made into movies around 1913, so a long time ago. And these movies were super popular, and they were exactly the type of, non-classical, non-establishment culture that the Surrealists were very, very interested in, okay? They hated the establishment, really hated it, The most popular writer of the early 20th century was a French writer called Anatole France. And Anatole France was the most hated man by the Surrealists because he was the establishment artist. And Breton even wrote a text called A Corpse to, to talk about Anatole France when he was dead. So they were very interested in what was then called popular literature and popular culture, because there were still very clear differences between the two. So I will stop. Okay, there would be a million things to say about the doll, but I think it's over. All right, okay. So Hans Bellmer was a crazy guy in Germany who was doing photos of his crazy doll, and he sent a little book to the group, and he was immediately accepted into the group because, of course, it was everything they were dealing with. If you are interested in Sigmund Freud and the question of sexuality, if you are interested in the Marquis de Sade, this 18th century writer who came up with the notion of sadism, of suffering as a sexual gratification, you also ask questions about the body, how the integrity of the body can be threatened and how this literally destroys your identity, okay? So many of the things they were dealing with were addressed by the photos of Hans Bellmer that he immediately was accepted into the group. So it's a small book of photographies, some of them repainted over, made of an installation, basically, of the doll that he himself created, right? And some of them, to be perfectly honest, I find them very, very disturbing, all right? Which is why they're so interesting, precisely. Okay, this photo I really want to talk about. Sorry, I'll probably go over time, but sorry. So this is Breton in New York. Okay, of course, during the war, they were in America, okay, which is why their influence went beyond Europe, in a sense, thanks to the war. This is, for instance, This is Yves Tanguy. So he was a French artist who also went to America, became a French citizen, an American citizen eventually, married another artist, a lady from America. So this is André Breton. This is very important. This is a great French language poet. Was born on the Martinique island, which is still a French territory in the Caribbean. His name is Aimé Cesar. He became a French politician also eventually, and amazingly was the teacher of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon is the first writer of post-colonial studies. Okay, so these guys were major figures in the post-colonial movement that would soon start after the war. And this rather stern-looking fellow is Marcel Duchamp, all right? And Marcel Duchamp, who is seldom referred to as a surrealist artist. Generally, if he's classified as anything, he's classified as a Dada artist. So, this is the famous fountain, which apparently was something taken from this artist with a very complicated name, Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. That's probably why she's not remembered. When you have complicated names, it's more difficult. But of course, Duchamp, when he creates this, creates questions about the very nature of art and how context, defines meaning. So it's really something that goes far beyond the questions raised by surrealism. But, for instance, he participated, even though he was in America stayed there, but he participated in most of the retrospective exhibitions of Surrealism. This catalogue for the Surrealist exhibition in 1947 was created by Marcel Duchamp. Okay, so Duchamp always felt close to the Surrealist movement and to André Breton in particular. So the fact that they were in America really had an influence on the works of Jackson Pollock. All right, and again, I was very happy. I wrote my article for Dong Xitran before I knew that there would be paintings by Jackson Pollock. Okay, so there's a painting by Jackson Pollock, very influenced by Native American culture. So that's also very, very interesting and very important. And I just wanted to conclude by showing you, so just jump to this, basically the only Chinese artist who claimed to be a Surrealist artist in the 1930s. He's from Guangdong province, right? So these two works are in fact in the Guangzhou Art Museum. But of course, like many artists from China at the time, he couldn't go to Europe, so he learned about Surrealism in Japan. And interestingly, there's a lot of Surrealist artists in Japan in the 1930s. Okay, so Surrealism really played a very important part in the modernist movement of Japan. But I just wanted to show you this just to make sure you understand that there's no Surrealism in China. It's got nothing to do with, people might think that it's because Chinese culture is sort of rejecting that sort of thinking. So I don't believe it's true at all. This is a few works from someone who is mostly famous as a writer. This is Wen Yituo. But he did this very famous painting of this Ming Dynasty writer. So she's a young woman who was stuck at home, basically. And so this is just a painting by Wen Yituo. But I just want to talk about this because there was an essay written by this guy, all right? English name is Quentin Pan. So he was a sociologist, but he was one of the first person to have read Sigmund Freud in China in the 1930s. And he wrote an essay about this character, Feng Xiaoqing, who is a real writer from the Ming Dynasty, and analyzed her attitude according to the ideas of Freud concerning narcissism. Okay, so there was interest especially in cities like Shanghai, of course, in the theories of Sigmund Freud. There was no reason there wouldn't be a Surrealist movement in China, but the fact that China was at war so quickly that it could not have happened. Okay? But the fact is that there is one artist, at least, who claims to be a Surrealist artist in China, okay, and again, because of its presence in Japan. So, I agonized at how much I would tell you, because there would be a lot more to say, especially around the idea of the myth, which is sort of the central theme of the exhibition. But I think a lot of the wall text and the captions tell a lot about this. I didn't think it was very important for me to deal with that in particular. So I'll just stop talking now.
Thank you so much, Professor Vaniel. And no worries about the exhibition, about the mythology, because Professor Frank Vaniel, he's going to give us a video particularly to our exhibition, which will be released in June. So by then, I think he will let us know more about the Surrealism in terms of mythology. But I mean, today, Professor Frank Vaniel gave us a very informative Surrealism, like across different kinds of artists, especially like from the later part, we even see the Chinese Surrealists, and also the development. You just mentioned some of the development in Japan as well. So as you can see, Surrealism definitely is not just from Paris, it's very international as well. And so I think we can now open to the ground and to see if you have any more questions. Basically, you can just ask. I mean, Professor Frank Vaniel, I think he has already prepared a lot in his PowerPoint. So if you can just ask anything, and maybe he can immediately give you the picture as well. Yeah. So maybe I can start first.
Okay.
Yeah. But this one is, I'm not sure how many of you has already visited our exhibition. And then we have one artwork called The Ground Transparent in our last session. So I would like to know if the ground transparent has something to do with Duchamp's The Ground Glass.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what the catalog says anyway.
And also,
So,
yeah.
It also has to do with, sorry, this is not very practical, with Georges Battai and the magazine Acéphale, which means, without a head. So, Marcel Duchamp, I don't have it here, made a very famous work called The Great Glass. The actual title is much longer. It's about, it's this idea of being logic in absurdity. So, his most famous artwork before that was the Nude Descending a Staircase, which is basically a futurist painting in the sense that it represents one figure descending a staircase, integrating all the moments into one painting. So this idea of integrating all the moments in one painting is something the futurists in Italy were doing. The cubists in Paris were not doing that. They were representing one object from all different sides on one painting, but there was no movement. So Duchamp was harshly criticized doing this, especially by his two brothers who were themselves cubist painters. And out of this Nude Descending a Staircase, he started to think about other artworks, other paintings. So he was talking about young men interested in the young woman descending the staircase. So they were bachelors. And I forgot the logic, but there was a chocolate grinder somewhere. Don't ask me, okay? So all this he integrated into a giant artwork with the bachelors, with the bride, the chocolate grinder, and all this, into an artwork. And for years, he agonized as how to show this, because he didn't want the background to influence us. So he decided to put it on the glass, right? So it was completely transparent with all these objects there. So it has to do with this sort of undermining rationality by using its own tools, its own weapons. You are conducting your logical conclusions to all these artworks, but it only makes sense to you, okay? So that's the Grand Transparent. That's how it was related to this desire to use the weapons of rationality against itself, basically, which is also what this idea is about, okay? So this, remember, this is the cover of a magazine founded by Georges Battai, who was probably the best theorist and, let's say, philosopher to address the question of reason and rationality in Western culture, and trying to undermine it by, again, using its own weapons. So that's why he's also invited a lot of poets, but also sociologists and ethnologists to write for this paper. So the Grand Transparent is about this. It's about using the tools of reason against itself. Okay. I just want... Oh, yes, no, not here. There is a copy of document upstairs in a glass case, and I was pointing out that you may want to see it. And on the first line, you have an article by an art historian and ethnologist called Paul Pelliot, who is also very famous in China because he's the guy who stole all the Buddhist scrolls at Tunhuang. All right, they're all in Paris now, and the Chinese government wants them back. The French government said never. Okay. So, all right, you have a lot of really important people. Let me see. Carl Einstein, nothing to do with the physicist. He was a philosopher and art critic. This is very interesting to me. Roger Gilbert Leconte was, to me, one of the greatest poets of that generation, who belonged to another group called Le Grand Jeu, the Great Game, who is basically forgotten today. And that's, to me, one of the least interesting part of Surrealism. It was so important. And Breton took so much place that whatever happened at the same time in Paris is now almost forgotten. All right? And this poet, Roger Gilbert Lecomte, is basically unknown today, all right, because of the incredible importance of Surrealism. And I would say that in Europe, and probably even more in France, it never went away. And somehow we always relate art making to Surrealism in France, which can be a problem sometimes. Yes, you see Marcel Mauss here. Can you see it? No, yes. This is, sorry, I'm glad she's here. This is Wang Wai-yin. She's a very, very important Hong Kong artist. Very glad to say that she's also doing her PhD in my department. And she's studying socially engaged art practice. And one of the concepts she wants to explore is the concept of the gift, which is exactly what Marcel Mauss has been studying, especially in the culture of North America. All right, and again, upstairs, you'll see a lot of videos on Native Americans who are very important to the Surrealists also. Sorry, that was only for your question. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your sharing. I love it. It takes me right back to my art history days at university. So my question is, I couldn't help but wonder, is that a picture of a building by Le Corbusier in your PowerPoint?
Yes, there was, actually.
And I'm really curious how that has to do with Surrealism.
I wanted to delete it, but I didn't have the time.
I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah. So, sorry. Okay, it's basically kind of the opposite. So, you know, this is a famous building by Antoni Gaudí in Barcelona. And for Dali, this was sort of the greatest architecture ever made because it looks soft, all right? And there is a fascination for the soft in Dali that also has a lot to do with things that Breton hated, for instance. There's a lot of shit and excrement in the paintings of Dali. Okay, sometimes he calls them soft beans. Okay, even in the film, The Golden Age, there's an image where you see a woman. You see a couple having sex on the ground, and then you see an image of a woman looking passionately to the screen, and the next image is a toilet. So you have to wonder whether, her face was her being passionate or just taking a shit. And then there's an image of lava from a volcano. Because it's black and white, it looks like shit. Okay, so there's shit everywhere in Dali. And the softness of this, the reference to the body, in those things that you never talk about the body, was also the sort of things that Georges Battai was interested in. So for him, for Dali, the building of Gaudi are genius, especially this building, not really the others. This building is genius precisely because it refers to the body. It refers to especially those things that we don't want to talk about the body. And for these guys, the absolute opposite, the perfect representation of rationality and reason and mathematics and everything is Le Corbusier. So he hated Le Corbusier, clearly. That's the modernity they wanted nothing to do with, in fact.
Thank you.
May I just say something? I know, we may not have enough time, but the last part that you mentioned about the influence of Surrealist movement, on Asia, that part is interesting, and it's something that the exhibition, we didn't cover this part. Yes. So this is something maybe, in the future, during this exhibition period, we may have another talk, to talk about, how it influenced the Japanese artists that you just mentioned, because I think this is something that, the Hong Kong audience may feel closer or feel more connected to what we are
Sure.
living now. So I think this part, I hope I don't know now if you have some time to talk about that, but maybe in the future we can have a talk. To
I'll have to do a lot of preparations because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think Amy here, she introduced herself. because Amy, she is our assistant curator of this exhibition, and actually we will have a talk specifically on the HKMOA collection. So curators from Museum of Arts, they will specifically talking about the Hong Kong artists inspired by Surrealism. So will be Chen Fuxin, Ha Beiqun, etc. So by then, we may have some sort of conversations later we can explore together and see if Frank, you can contribute some more from the Japanese artists to have sort of the conversations later. Yeah, but or Asian artists, but that's something we can explore in the coming months. Yeah.
I know a lot more about Hong Kong artists concerning this than Japanese artists, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot to explore, just
Yes.
as you just mentioned. Surrealism is not just about the big names, big words we used to know, but from this exhibition specifically, I find very interesting because it's telling a lot of untold perspectives. So that means a lot to explore, right? So maybe we have time for one more question. Anyone from our Facebook Live asking the question? Okay, that's good. Yeah. So, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And stay tuned to our French-made social media, and then we will have a lot more coming up. As you can see, we can explore a lot more.
Try not, I guess it's already closed for registration, but tomorrow's talk should be really,
tomorrow is
really
full,
interesting. Yeah.
but tomorrow definitely is very interesting. It's Surrealism in Hong Kong ballet, so it's full, but
Maybe you can share the recording later on.
but tomorrow is no recording. But for today's audience here, if you are interested, you can register to me after the talk.
Hopefully someone will do a pirate recording tomorrow.
Maybe, yeah. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
one more very important thing. Please kindly fill in the survey for us because your feedbacks are very important to us. And our apprentices, they will collect your survey at the end exit. Yeah. And thank you again, Professor Frank Vignon.
Thank you.
It was a very nice talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia.